Imagine you are standing on the deck of a cargo ship somewhere in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. The year is 1941. The water is freezing. The wind is howling. Somewhere above the clouds, you know a German Focke-Wulf Condor is circling, radioing your position to a wolf pack of U-boats waiting beneath the surface. You have no destroyer escort. You have no aircraft carrier nearby. You have nothing between you and destruction except the cargo you are carrying and the hope that somehow, someway, something will come to save you. And then from the bow of your own ship, a hurricane fighter roars to life, strapped to a rocket-powered catapult pointed directly into the sky. One pilot, one aircraft, no landing strip, no second chances. This is not science fiction. This is not a movie. This happened. This was real. And today, we are going to tell the complete story of one of the most desperate, ingenious, and tragically overlooked chapters in the entire history of naval warfare. The story of CAM ships and MAC ships. The story of how Britain turned ordinary merchant vessels into floating airfields to survive one of the darkest periods in human history. To understand why these ships existed, you have to understand the world that created them. By 1940, Britain was in a position that very few nations in modern history have ever faced. It was an island nation, completely dependent on the sea for its survival. Every bullet, every tank, every gallon of fuel, every pound of food that kept the British people alive, and the British military fighting had to come across the ocean. The Atlantic Ocean was not just a strategic asset, it was a lifeline, and Adolf Hitler understood this perfectly. His admirals, particularly Karl Dönitz, had developed a strategy that was elegant in its brutality. If you could cut Britain off from its supplies, Britain would starve. Britain would run out of ammunition. Britain would collapse without a single German soldier ever setting foot on English soil. The weapon they chose for this strategy was the submarine, the U-boat. And in the early years of the war, the U-boat campaign was devastatingly effective. The first years of the conflict, German submarines were sinking British and Allied merchant ships at a rate that defied belief. Month after month, the tonnage lost climbed higher and higher. Crews were lost, cargoes were lost. Ships that had taken years to build were sent to the bottom in minutes. The men who sailed these vessels knew the odds. They knew that every convoy they joined might be their last. They sailed anyway because someone had to. Britain needed those supplies. The nation needed those men to keep sailing. But the losses were becoming unsustainable. Something had to change. Something had to be done. And what made the U-boat crisis so particularly vicious was the role of air power. The Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor was an aircraft that had originally been designed as a long-range civilian airliner. But when war came, the Germans converted it into something far more sinister. Armed with bombs and torpedoes, flying out of bases in Norway and France, the Condor could range far out into the Atlantic, well beyond the reach of shore-based British fighters. And when a Condor found a convoy, it did not always attack immediately. Sometimes it simply circled at a distance, just out of range, transmitting the convoy's position, course, and speed by radio to the waiting U-boats below. Other times it came in low and fast, dropping bombs and torpedoes, raking ships with cannon fire, and then disappearing back into the clouds before anything could be done. Winston Churchill himself called the Condor the scourge of the Atlantic, and that is not an exaggeration. Between 1940 and 1941, Condors alone sank hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping. They were killers. They were efficient killers, and the Allies had almost no answer for them. The obvious answer was air cover. If you could put fighters over the convoys, the Condors could be driven off or shot down. The U-boats, deprived of their aerial spotters and forced to operate against convoys that now had fighter protection, would find their task far more difficult. Everyone in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force understood this. The problem was how to do it. Building dedicated aircraft carriers took years. Britain did not have years. The existing Royal Navy carriers were desperately needed elsewhere, covering operations in the Mediterranean, supporting fleet actions, protecting other vital routes. There simply were not enough carriers to provide air cover for every Atlantic convoy, and so someone had to think differently. Someone had to look at the resources that existed, at the ships that were already sailing, and ask the question that changed everything. What if we put a fighter on top of a merchant ship? The concept sounds almost absurdly simple when you first hear it. Take a merchant ship, build a steel ramp at the bow, mount a catapult on the ramp, put a Hurricane fighter on the catapult. When a German aircraft appears, fire the Hurricane into the sky. Let the pilot deal with the threat. It sounds simple. It was not simple. It was in fact a solution so fraught with difficulties, so demanding of the men who implemented it, so reliant on human courage operating at its absolute limit, that when you hear the full details, you will understand why the pilots who flew from these ships are remembered with a special kind of reverence by those who know the history. The program was formally developed in late 1940 and early 1941, driven by the desperate urgency of the convoy crisis. The British Admiralty, working with the Ministry of War Transport, began identifying suitable merchant ships that could be converted. The requirements were not complicated, because they could not afford complicated. The ships needed to have enough deck space at the bow to accommodate a catapult structure. They needed to be structurally sound enough to bear the additional weight and the stresses of the catapult launch. And they needed to continue functioning as merchant ships, carrying their cargoes, because Britain needed those cargoes just as much as it needed the fighters. These were not warships being converted. These were working cargo vessels, tankers, grain ships, refrigerated ships, being modified to also carry a single aircraft and the small crew needed to maintain it. The catapult itself was a remarkable piece of engineering developed under extreme time pressure. It was a rocket-assisted ramp, not the steam-powered catapult systems you would find on a proper aircraft carrier. The Hurricane would be secured to a trolley on the ramp. When the moment came, a battery of cordite rockets would fire, accelerating the aircraft from 0 to flying speed in a matter of feet, hurling it into the air with tremendous force. The pilot inside would experience acceleration forces that pushed him back into his seat with considerable violence. The system worked. But it had one fundamental characteristic that made every single launch an act of absolute commitment. Once the Hurricane left the catapult, there was no way to land it back on the ship. The ramp went one way, forward, into the sky. There was no deck to land on. There was no recovery system. If the pilot flew his mission and survived, his options at the end were simple and stark. He could try to find land if land was within range, which over the mid-Atlantic it never was. He could try to locate a proper aircraft carrier or a friendly airfield, if such a thing existed within his fuel range, which it usually did not. Or he could ditch his aircraft in the sea alongside the ship, hope that the freezing Atlantic water did not kill him before the ship's crew could lower a boat, and hope that the boat could reach him before hypothermia set in. These were the choices, and the pilots knew these were the choices before they climbed into the cockpit. The aircraft chosen for the CAM ship program was the Hawker Hurricane, specifically the Sea Hurricane, a version adapted for maritime operations. The Hurricane was not the newest fighter in the Royal Air Force inventory by 1941. The Spitfire was faster, more glamorous, more celebrated. But the Hurricane was tough. It was reliable. It could absorb punishment and keep flying. And critically, it was available in sufficient numbers. The Sea Hurricane carried the standard armament of 8 Browning machine guns in its wings, perfectly capable of dealing with a Focke-Wulf Condor or any other German aircraft it was likely to encounter. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was a lethal weapon, and the pilots assigned to the CAM ship program were skilled. They had to be. The men who flew from CAM ships were a unique breed even within the already exceptional world of wartime fighter pilots. They were volunteers, every one of them. No one was ordered to fly from a catapult on a merchant ship with no guaranteed way home. The Royal Navy and the RAF asked for volunteers, and men came forward. Some were experienced combat veterans who had fought in the Battle of Britain. Some were younger pilots with less experience but the same spirit. They were organized into the merchant ship fighter unit, and they rotated through the ships, spending weeks and sometimes months at sea on vessels that had no real military facilities. sleeping in whatever accommodation the merchant ship could spare, eating merchant navy food, living in a world that was somewhere between a warship and a cargo freighter. They maintained their own aircraft with limited tools and limited space. They kept themselves ready to fly at a moment's notice, day or night, in whether that would have grounded operations at any sensible airfield. And they did all of this knowing that every time they strapped into that cockpit and the rockets fired, they were betting their life on what happened next. The first CAM ship to enter service was the Michael E., converted in early 1941. Others followed quickly, because the need was urgent. At the peak of the program, there were approximately 35 CAM ships operating, spread across convoy routes in the Atlantic and also into the Arctic, supplying the Soviet Union via the famous Arctic convoys that ran to Murmansk and Archangel. The conditions on the Arctic convoys were beyond brutal. If the North Atlantic was dangerous and uncomfortable, the Arctic route was something that challenged human endurance at its very core. Temperatures that froze spray into ice on the rigging before it could fall, seas that were mountainous and unpredictable, German air attack, submarine attack, and surface ship attack to contend with simultaneously. And through all of this, a CAM ship pilot might be expected to launch, fight, survive if he could, and then ditch in water that would kill an unprotected man in minutes. One of the most celebrated actions involving a CAM ship took place in August 1941, and it tells you everything you need to know about what these men were made of. The merchant ship Empire Foam was sailing with a convoy when a Focke-Wulf Condor was spotted. The Hurricane pilot, a young officer whose name deserves to be remembered and celebrated, was launched from the catapult. He engaged the Condor, and after a fierce fight he damaged the German aircraft enough to drive it away from the convoy. His fuel was running low. There was no land within range. He had no choice but to ditch. He brought his Hurricane down alongside the convoy, put it into the sea as gently as he could manage at the speed required, and was pulled from the freezing water by the crew of a nearby ship. He survived. He returned to service. He flew again. This was not an unusual story in the CAM ship program. This was Tuesday. There were also cases where the pilot did not survive, where the ditching went wrong, where the sea was too rough for a rescue boat, where hypothermia claimed a man before help could reach him. The program knew losses. Every program in a war of this scale knew losses. But what is remarkable is not the losses. What is remarkable is that the men kept coming forward. That when a pilot was lost, another pilot was there to take his place. That the courage required to do this thing was not in short supply, even as the thing itself demanded everything a human being could give. The tactical impact of the CAM ships in their early months of operation was significant beyond what the raw numbers might suggest. The Focke-Wulf Condors were not stupid. Their crews were professionals who valued their lives and their aircraft. When word spread that convoys now had fighter protection, however limited and however improvised, the Condor crews became more cautious. They flew higher. They stayed at greater distances. Their ability to accurately observe and report convoy positions was degraded. Their bombing accuracy fell. The psychological effect on the merchant crews was also enormous. To know that there was a fighter, one fighter, on that ship at the bow, ready to launch, ready to fight, ready to defend the convoy, gave men a sense of not being entirely alone against whatever the Atlantic sky might send against them. Morale is not a trivial thing in warfare. Morale keeps men at their posts when every instinct tells them to abandon ship. And the CAM ships helped maintain that morale through some of the darkest months of the Atlantic War. But one fighter per ship with no possibility of recovery was always a temporary solution. The brilliant minds at the Admiralty and in naval aviation knew this. What they wanted, what they were working toward, was something better. Something that could provide continuous air cover, not just a single desperate scramble and then nothing for the rest of the convoy's crossing. And out of this thinking, a second innovation was born. The merchant aircraft carrier, the MAC ship. The MAC ship was a more ambitious and more practical solution than the CAM ship. Instead of a catapult and a ramp bolted onto an existing vessel's bow, The Mac ship concept involved more substantial modification. Selected merchant ships, specifically bulk grain carriers and tankers chosen for their size and relatively simple superstructure, were given a full-length flight deck constructed above their main deck. This flight deck was not as long as a proper aircraft carrier's deck. It was not equipped with the full range of facilities you would find on a warship, but it was a real deck, a deck that aircraft could take off from and, critically, land back on. The ships retained their cargo-carrying function. They still sailed with the grain in their holds or the oil in their tanks. They still contributed directly to Britain's supply lifeline. But now, sitting above all of that, was a flat steel runway that could operate aircraft continuously for the duration of a convoy crossing. The aircraft chosen for the Mac ships were not fighters but anti-submarine patrol aircraft. Specifically, the Fairey Swordfish, that beloved and improbable biplane that looked like it belonged to a different war entirely. The Swordfish had already proven itself capable of remarkable things, most famously at the Battle of Taranto, where Swordfish torpedo bombers had crippled the Italian battle fleet in a single night operation. On Mac ships, the Swordfish flew a different mission. Equipped with depth charges, radar, and sonar buoys, Swordfish operating from Mac ships could hunt U-boats. They could fly ahead of the convoy, sweep the sea lanes, force submarines to dive deep and lose contact with their targets, and drop depth charges on submerged boats that had been detected. The Swordfish was slow by any modern standard. It was fabric-covered and open cockpit. Its pilots flew in conditions that required multiple layers of clothing and still froze. But the Swordfish could take off from and land on a very short deck in conditions that would have been impossible for faster, heavier aircraft. Its low stall speed and forgiving handling characteristics made it exactly right for this demanding and peculiar operating environment. The first Mac ship to enter service was the Empire MacAlpine, and she entered service in 1943. This was later in the war than the CAM ships, reflecting the more complex engineering and conversion work required. But the timing was actually quite deliberate. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was reaching its critical phase. German U-boat production had continued at high rates throughout the war, and the Wolf-Pack tactics Dernitz had developed were reaching their peak effectiveness. But Allied technology and tactics were also improving. More convoy escorts, better radar, long-range patrol aircraft from shore bases, the introduction of cracked German naval codes that allowed convoys to be routed away from Wolf-Pack concentrations. The Mac ships arrived at precisely the moment when their contribution could be most decisive. The flight operations on Mac ships were a test of every skill that naval aviation had developed, and some it had to develop fresh. The flight deck was short, far shorter than anything that peacetime aviation planners would have considered adequate. It was wet because spray constantly washed over it in heavy weather. It moved because the ships rolled and pitched in the Atlantic swell. It was often dark because convoys traveled at night when possible to make themselves harder targets. Swordfish pilots approaching a Mac ship for landing were dealing with all of these challenges simultaneously, looking for a tiny moving platform in a huge dark sea, judging their approach speed and angle, watching for the batsman, the deck landing control officer whose paddle signals guided them in, fighting crosswinds and downdrafts, trying not to think too hard about what happened if they misjudged and went into the sea in front of the ship. Deck landing on a fleet carrier in peacetime was considered one of the most demanding skills in aviation. Deck landing on a Mac ship in the North Atlantic at night in heavy weather in wartime was something else entirely. The batsman's job on a Mac ship deserves a chapter of its own in any history of naval aviation. Standing at the edge of the flight deck, exposed to wind and spray, holding his paddles, watching the approaching aircraft and sending signals that could mean the difference between a safe landing and a fatal crash, the batsman combined practical knowledge, fast reflexes, and an almost supernatural ability to read an aircraft's attitude and trajectory from a considerable distance. A wave-off signal meant go around, try again. A cut signal meant throttle back. You are in position, come on down. Getting these signals wrong or misreading them could put an aircraft into the deck, into the sea, or into the island structure. The batsmen on Mac ships did their job in conditions that would seem impossible, and they did it successfully, time and time again. The Swordfish squadrons assigned to Mac ships were part of the Fleet Air Arm, the Royal Navy's aviation branch. These were career naval officers and ratings, trained in the disciplines of shipboard aviation, but adapting those disciplines to circumstances that no training manual had fully anticipated. The squadrons were small, typically 4 aircraft per Mac ship, with a corresponding maintenance crew of mechanics, riggers, armorers, and specialists who worked in a tiny hangar below the flight deck, servicing aircraft in conditions of cramped darkness and constant motion. When a Swordfish came back from a patrol, it had to be manhandled into the hangar elevator, struck below, serviced and refueled and rearmed, then brought back up and ranged on deck ready for the next sortie. All of this in a ship that was rolling in Atlantic swells, surrounded by a convoy that expected continuous air coverage. The maintenance crews were unsung heroes of the Mac ship program. Their names appear in no famous histories. Their faces look out from a handful of photographs, all stained and tired. They deserve to be remembered. Beyond the physical challenges, there was the sheer boredom and tension of convoy escort, the peculiar combination that those who have served at sea in wartime know well. Hours of routine patrol, scanning an empty sea, monitoring instruments, fighting the cold and the monotony. And then without warning, contact. A radar return that might be a submarine snorkel, a radio signal. A change in behavior from the convoy commodore's ship, and everything changed instantly. The boredom was gone. In its place was urgent, focused, disciplined action. The Swordfish turning onto a new heading, the depth charges being armed, the crew of 3 pilot, observer, telegraphist, each doing their job without wasted motion. The attack run, the charges rolling from under the wings into the sea, the explosion beneath the surface. And then the long wait watching for oil, for debris, for the signs that a submarine had been destroyed or at least forced to abort its attack. It is worth pausing here to consider what these anti-submarine patrols meant in human terms. On one side, you had the Swordfish crew, 3 young men in an open biplane, freezing, hours from anywhere, hunting. On the other side, beneath the surface of the same ocean, were the crews of U-boats, young men as well for the most part. German sailors who had their own courage and their own fear, who breathed recycled air in steel tubes, who heard the ping of Allied sonar and knew what it meant, who lay on the bottom of the sea when the depth charges came. The Atlantic War was fought between human beings who had more in common with each other than the ideologies that had set them against each other. This does not excuse what the U-boats did. But it is worth remembering when we talk about anti-submarine warfare that we are talking about one set of human beings doing everything they could to kill another set of human beings, and both sides doing it with extraordinary skill and extraordinary courage. By 1943, there were 19 Mac ships in service, operating on convoy routes across the Atlantic and into the Arctic. Their operational record was remarkable. No convoy that included a Mac ship ever lost a vessel to air attack. Read that again. No convoy that included a Mac ship was ever attacked successfully from the air. The deterrent effect of even a small number of Swordfish patrolling above the convoy was enough to keep German aircraft at bay, and the anti-submarine contribution was equally significant. Swordfish from Mac ships made dozens of attacks on U-boats during the war. Some of these attacks were confirmed kills. Others damaged submarines, forcing them to abort patrols, requiring them to return to base for repairs, removing them from the convoy battle for weeks or months at a time. Every U-boat that was forced to dive deep and break contact was a U-boat that was not sinking merchant ships. Every merchant ship that reached port was oil, food, ammunition, tanks, aircraft, arriving in Britain to keep the war going. The Mac ships operated as part of much larger convoy escort groups, working alongside destroyers, frigates, corvettes, and shore-based aircraft where these were available. The relationship between the Mac ship's swordfish and the surface escorts was one of careful coordination. Swordfish could range much further than a surface ship could effectively search. They could see from above what was invisible from the surface. They could vector the escorts toward contacts, dropping marker flares to show where a submarine had dived. They were the eyes above the battle, and the escorts were the weapons that could close and attack. This combination, aircraft and surface ships working together with shared information and coordinated tactics, was one of the key innovations that eventually turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. The Mac ships were a crucial part of making it work across the whole convoy route, rather than just near the shores where shore-based aircraft could reach. The crews of the merchant ships that carried the Mac ship flight decks occupied a peculiar and fascinating position in the hierarchy of the wartime maritime world. They were civilians, employed by shipping companies, sailing under the red ensign of the British Merchant Marine. They were not naval officers. They did not hold military rank. But they were operating vessels that now carried military aircraft and military personnel, conducting military operations in a military campaign. The relationship between the merchant crew and the Fleet Air Arm personnel who shared their ship was generally positive, but not without its occasional frictions. The merchant sailors had their ways of doing things built up over years at sea. The naval aviators had their traditions and their disciplines. On a small ship in the middle of the ocean, learning to share space and purpose, these two very different cultures had to find a working relationship. By most accounts they did, and did so with the pragmatic good humor that the British often manage in extreme circumstances. There is a story that captures something essential about the Mac ship world. A swordfish pilot returning from a long anti-submarine patrol, frozen through, exhausted, having found nothing, botched his first approach to the deck and had to go around. On his second approach, he came in too high. On his third approach, the batsman waved him off again because of a gust that pushed him off the center line. By the fourth approach, he was very low on fuel. His observer passed him a note. It said simply, "Please land this time." He landed perfectly. Afterward, someone asked him what he was thinking on that fourth approach, knowing he barely had enough fuel for one more attempt. He said he was thinking about dinner. He was very hungry. This is the spirit of people who do difficult and dangerous things every day until it becomes simply the thing they do. Not heroic in their own minds, just doing the job. The technology behind both the CAM and Mac ship programs was driven by tremendous ingenuity and pragmatism. The engineers who designed the catapult systems for CAM ships had to calculate rocket thrust, aircraft weight, wind over deck, and launch speed with limited computing tools, doing their calculations by hand and testing their assumptions with live trials that could not afford to fail. The designers of the Mac ship flight decks had to create a structure strong enough to bear the weight of aircraft and the stress of landing impacts, fitted onto a ship that was still operating as a cargo carrier, without compromising the ship's stability or seakeeping. The arrestor gear systems. The wires stretched across the deck that caught the hook on an incoming swordfish and stopped it before it went over the far end, had to work reliably in sea water and salt air, in temperatures ranging from below freezing to relatively mild, under operational conditions that provided no opportunity for extended maintenance shutdowns. All of this was accomplished, not by peacetime research programs with unlimited budgets and years of development time, but by engineers working under pressure, with limited resources, against a deadline measured not in years but in months, because every month that passed was another month in which the Atlantic was killing British merchant seamen and sinking the ships Britain needed to survive. The industrial effort required to convert merchant ships to CAM and Mac configuration was itself significant. Steel workers, welders, shipwrights, electricians, all of the trades that build and maintain ships had to be directed toward this conversion work while simultaneously building new ships to replace those being lost to U-boats. The shipyards of Britain and Canada worked around the clock. Workers in these yards knew what was at stake. The ships they were building and converting were the vessels that would carry food to their families, ammunition to the soldiers fighting in North Africa and later in Europe, fuel to keep the aircraft flying that protected British cities. This was not abstract patriotism. It was concrete, immediate, and personal. Canada's role in the Mac ship program is often overlooked even by those who know the broader story. Canadian shipyards built many of the hulls that were converted to Mac ships. Canadian naval escorts sailed alongside Mac ships on convoy duty. Canadian swordfish crews served in the Fleet Air Arm and flew from Mac ship decks. Canada's contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic, across all dimensions of that campaign, was enormous, and the Mac ship story is part of that contribution. Similarly, the merchant mariners who sailed the ships were an extraordinarily international group. British, Canadian, American, Norwegian, Dutch, Polish, Greek, and many other nationalities sailed together in the convoys that kept Britain alive. When we speak of CAM ships and Mac ships, we are speaking of an international effort, drawing on courage and skill from across the Allied world. The German response to the introduction of CAM and Mac ships tells us something important about how effective these innovations were. German naval intelligence was well aware of the catapult ships from early in the program. Condor crews were briefed to identify CAM ships and warned that the merchant ship they had previously regarded as defenseless prey might now be capable of launching a fighter. The psychological effect on Condor crews was significant. Operating over the open ocean, far from any Luftwaffe fighter cover of their own, the prospect of a sea hurricane appearing from below was genuinely alarming. Aircraft that had previously made low-level attacks on convoys began to fly higher and hold off at greater ranges. This alone saved ships and lives even before a single CAM ship hurricane had fired its guns in anger. Fear of a weapon can be as potent as the weapon itself. The U-boat arms response to Mac ship aviation was also instructive. As the swordfish patrols from Mac ships became a regular feature of convoy escort, U-boat commanders had to adapt their tactics. The practice of surfacing to make high-speed runs to get ahead of a convoy became more dangerous when an aircraft might appear at any moment to catch the submarine in its vulnerable surface state. Attacks that previously might have been pressed home with relative confidence had to be calculated against the risk of air attack. The U-boat was at its most vulnerable when it was on the surface or near the surface. Mac ship swordfish could see the surface across a wide area. The combination changed the tactical calculus for every U-boat commander who knew he was operating near a convoy that had air cover. One aspect of the Mac ship program that deserves particular attention is the role of women in supporting it. While the flight crews and ships companies were almost entirely male, the industrial infrastructure that made the program possible employed women in vast numbers. Women workers in the shipyards helped build and convert the ships. Women in factories manufactured the components. Women in uniformed services handled the logistics, communications, and administration that kept the convoys running. The Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens, known as the Wrens, provided personnel across the naval organization that supported convoy operations. Their contribution was indispensable, and it was made with the same commitment and competence as the contribution of the men who sailed the ships and flew the aircraft. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the overall character of the Battle of the Atlantic was changing. The crisis was not over, but the balance of power was shifting. New technologies and new tactics were giving the Allies the upper hand. Very long-range aircraft, the Liberator bomber in particular, were beginning to close the mid-ocean gap where convoys had previously been beyond the reach of shore-based air cover. More escort carriers, purpose-built or converted from merchant hulls with proper naval facilities, were entering service. Better radar, better sonar, better training, and the intelligence advantage provided by code breaking were all bearing fruit. The U-boats were suffering catastrophic losses in 1943, with dozens of boats sunk in a single month during the crisis of May 1943. Dönitz was forced to temporarily withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The tide had turned. In this changing environment, The CAM ships and MAC ships continued to serve, but their role was becoming part of a larger, more capable system rather than the desperate improvisation of the early war years. The CAM ship program was drawing down by 1943, its function being taken over by escort carriers and by shore-based aircraft that could now reach further out to sea. The MAC ships continued operating into 1944 and beyond, still providing a valuable contribution to convoy protection, still flying swordfish patrols, still representing that extraordinary moment in history when merchant grain ships and tankers had become aircraft carriers. The human cost of the entire Battle of the Atlantic, within which the CAM and MAC ship story sits, was staggering. Over 30,000 British merchant mariners lost their lives during the war. Tens of thousands more Allied seamen from other nations died on the convoy routes. The German U-boat arm suffered losses that amounted to one of the highest casualty rates of any service in any military in the war. Approximately 75% of the men who served in U-boats were killed in action. These are numbers that are almost too large to hold in the mind. Each one represents a human being, a story, a family bereaved. The CAM ships and MAC ships were tiny elements in this vast and terrible campaign, but they were elements that saved lives. Ships that were not sunk because a condor was driven off. Convoys that got through because a swordfish forced a U-boat to dive and lose contact. Merchant seamen who made it home because an anti-submarine patrol was in the right place at the right moment. The legacy of the CAM and MAC ship programs extends beyond the specific tactical contributions they made. These programs demonstrated something profound about the relationship between innovation and necessity in warfare. When conventional solutions were unavailable, when the standard tools of naval aviation, fleet carriers, shore-based aircraft could not be brought to bear on the problem, the British naval and aviation establishment found unconventional solutions. They took what was available and made it work. They did not wait for the ideal. They improvised with the actual. And in doing so, they kept convoys moving, kept Britain supplied, and contributed to the eventual Allied victory in the Atlantic that made D-Day possible, that made the liberation of Europe possible, that ultimately shaped the outcome of the entire war. The precedent set by CAM and MAC ships also influenced post-war naval thinking. The concept of the merchant aviation carrier was revisited in different forms during the Cold War, and the general idea of providing air cover to convoys through improvised or merchant-based aviation remained part of naval planning contingencies for decades. When British naval planners in the 1980s faced the challenge of the Falklands War and needed to operate aircraft from converted merchant ships and container vessels, the intellectual heritage of the MAC ship program was part of the tradition they were drawing on. The men who built these ships, who designed the catapults, who modified the flight decks, who maintained the aircraft in impossible conditions, who flew the Hurricanes with no guarantee of coming back, who flew the Swordfish through Atlantic nights in search of submarines, who stood on heaving wet decks waving batsmen's paddles at incoming aircraft, who sailed the merchant ships that carried flight decks above their grain holds. All of these people deserve to be known. Their story is not as famous as the Battle of Britain. It does not have the drama of D-Day or the iconic imagery of the Pacific naval battles. It is a quieter story in some ways. A story of ships that most people have never heard of, doing a job that most people don't know had to be done, in conditions that most people cannot imagine. But without them, the story of the Second World War might have ended very differently. There is a final image that I want you to carry with you from this story. It is not a famous photograph. It is not a celebrated moment. It is simply this. Somewhere in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, in the gray and heaving winter of 1942, a convoy is moving west to east. 50 ships perhaps, or 60. Tankers, freighters, grain ships, refrigerator ships. Each one carrying the stuff that Britain needs to keep fighting and keep eating. Above the convoy, circling slowly, flying through cloud and breaking into open sky, is a Swordfish biplane. It is a ridiculous-looking machine to be flying over the cold gray Atlantic in the middle of the most mechanized war in human history. It has struts and wires and fabric wings. Its pilot is wearing so many layers of clothing he can barely move his arms. He is cold. He is tired. He has been airborne for 3 hours and he has found nothing. But he is there. He is watching. He is the reason a Condor pilot 30 miles away is keeping his distance and heading home. He is the reason the convoy will make it across. He is the reason the men on those 50 or 60 ships will see another day. And eventually, when his fuel is running low, he will come back and land on that tiny flight deck riding the swells of the Atlantic, and the crew will drag his swordfish back and strike it below, and another crew will eat and sleep and get ready to go up again tomorrow. This is what won the Battle of the Atlantic. Not any single dramatic moment, but this. The daily, determined, unglamorous, absolutely essential business of keeping watch.